Welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show, that profiles the humans behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world, creating and inspiring the future. And for all those that like really great stories, I'm Ira Pastor, your life sciences ambassador along for this journey today. So on several recent shows, we have been discussing some of the novel funding mechanisms that have been emerging in and around the biotech space, specifically related to a lot of the unmet needs that we've been focusing on the show, particularly in the area of age tech and longevity biotechnology. We have talked about the $30 million Healthy Longevity Challenge at the National Academy of Medicine. We've talked about a related program, UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, $125 million Healthy Aging Challenge. We've talked to folks from the XPrize Foundation. A lot going on in this space. Today, however, we are going to head into the area of federal innovation research and development and some of the novel public-private sector partnership opportunities that exist between small businesses in the United States and the federal government. So the Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR program in the U.S., is coordinated by the Small Business Administration, and it's intended to help small businesses conduct research and development via various contracting grant mechanisms. And the projects have some type of potential for commercialization and meet specific needs of the United States government. There is also the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, which is a parallel program, which is similar but puts a little more emphasis on commercial success. And every year, about $2.5 billion in the United States is awarded through these programs. Today, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Todd Haim, who is Chief of the Office of Small Business Research at the National Institute of Aging, which is a division of the United States National Institutes of Health, which leads a broad scientific effort to understand the nature of aging and help ultimately to extend healthy, active years of life. Dr. Haim oversees the development and evolution of the office with the goal of improving the quantity and quality of both SBIR and STTR applications. Prior to this particular role, Dr. Haim was a program director at the National Cancer Institute in the SBIR Development Center there, working on the development of cancer therapeutics, preventive agents, drug discovery technologies. He also served as a research associate and technology policy fellow at the National Academy of Sciences. And prior to that, he was involved in postdoc fellowship work at Pfizer, where he was working on a collaboration between Pfizer and Washington University School of Medicine, St. Louis, looking at areas of cardiac contractility due to fatty acid accumulation. Dr. Haim graduated from Albert Einstein College of Medicine with a PhD in biomedical research, especially in physiology and cellular biophysics. He in turn got a certificate in technology commercialization from Johns Hopkins, and he's received numerous awards and honors, including the 2014 National Cancer Institute Leadership Development Award, the Director's Award, the Ninja Government Award for volunteerism in the field of health. All that being said, Dr. Haim, thank you for taking the time to come on the show today and talk with us for a little while.
Thank you so much for having me. And please feel free to call me Todd.
Thank you, Todd. It's a real pleasure. Before we get into some of the things that you're doing, could you just take a few minutes just to talk about yourself, if you would? We typically give our guests the floor, just if you can give your background, sort of, where you grew up, how you developed this interest in biomedical sciences and in biophysics, and ultimately sort of your interest in both, merging science and technology with sort of innovation and commercialization.
Yeah, sure. It's a story that weaves a bit, but I started. I grew up in New Jersey, Auburn, New Jersey, and I went to Rutgers University as an undergrad. No medical professionals in my family, but I was from day one always interested in biology, and I really got interested as I went through high school in the underlying mechanisms of disease. And that is what, pursued me down the research path and eventually going and getting a PhD. And if you went one step further in my background to when I was in college, actually, the first two experiences in biomedical health were around Alzheimer's disease. One being an internship at a Alzheimer's clinic. And we actually published a paper around caregiver depression and how it relates to Alzheimer's treatment. And the other being for Eisai Pharmaceuticals, where one of the projects I was working on was marketing of Aricept, which was launched a couple
Sure.
years prior to my being there. And then, as you talked about, I had a career since where I got my PhD at Albert Einstein, New York, then went to Pfizer, and then to the National Cancer Institute, where I got to do a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and was really interested in innovation, and that's what made me attracted to that specific office, and learned a lot about the startups and kind of the other side of my past experiences in big pharma. So, and then when the opportunity to come to NIA, and really, to me, it was in many ways going back to where it all started with Alzheimer's disease, was actually really exciting, but there was something that was really frustrating and eye-opening, that in the 20 years since that I haven't been in the field, there's been virtually no progress on the therapeutic front. 20 years ago, I was working on the marketing of Aricept, and Aricept is still one of the key treatments used. Yeah. Okay, so we know at NIA that we have our challenges cut out in front of us, but we are going to do everything we can to rise to those challenges.
Outstanding, outstanding. Working off of that, could you, I spent, in my previous career, some time down at NIH. I was involved in a CRADA with the National Institutes of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Diseases. I did some drug screening years ago with National Cancer Institute. National Institute of Aging, you're not located in Bethesda. You're in Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken. Could you talk a little bit about sort of where NIA fits into the broader NIH system, and sort of give us a little overview of sort of the purview and what you guys do in general?
Sure. So our intramural labs are in fact located in Baltimore.
Okay.
The extramural offices are located in Bethesda. We're actually in downtown Bethesda.
Okay.
Pretty close to the main NIH campus. But in terms of kind of where NIA fits in the overall, so it's one of the 27 institutes and centers at the NIH, but it's one that has had tremendous growth. I think its mission has always been to expand healthy aging and really address any aging-related diseases, but focus on diseases where the aging process is part of what we're trying to address. Of course, many of the institutes at the NIH do address diseases where the predominance is in the older adults. But what we focus on at NIA is really focusing on where aging pathology and aging processes are key parts of what we're trying to address. So we tend to focus on Alzheimer's disease. We are the primary institute for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And then we also focus on things that really are specific and primary to older adults. So you can imagine enabling older adults to live independently, to have social networks, anything really, and then of course, some of the diseases that are really central, like sarcopenia, diseases that do have a major effect on older adults, and where aging is a part of the disease. So it's a pretty wide gamut in terms of the types of areas that we fund, but one of the primary focuses is in fact Alzheimer's disease, and I think that's where the Institute has in many ways been through a transformation over the past 5 years, due to congressional attention to Alzheimer's disease and significant funding increases specific for Alzheimer's disease over the past 5 years. Our institute has grown in a very significant and rapid fashion. I think actually the most rapid fashion in NIH history for a specific institute. And that has allowed us to really do some new things that I'm happy to talk about.
Excellent, excellent. Before we get to that, if you could, when one looks at sort of the wide spectrum of things that NIH does, it's one of those and I've never worked in government, but I look at the annual budget, and it's 40 plus $40 billion, and obviously that goes across a wide range of different extramural funding, and the tens of thousands of grants that you do every year, and hundreds of thousands of researchers at universities. Could you, with that sort of starting with that number, could you take us through a little bit of the sort of the SBIR system and STTR, and then ultimately, obviously there's different phases of it involved, but if you could do a little walkthrough of that and sort of where these commercial sort of small business oriented systems fit within the big picture, that would be awesome.
Sure. Yeah. So if you had to take that $40 billion number and then think about SBIR. So SBIR is a congressional set-aside. So Congress actually requires that agencies that provide extramural funding, as in funding to universities, et cetera, take a percentage of that funding and provide it to small businesses through the SBIR and STTR programs, which are similar, but I can talk about some differences between those two. But that percentage is 3.2% for SBIR and 0.45% for STTR. So if you total them together, you're talking about 3.65% of that $40 billion that goes to the small business SBIR and STTR programs. Okay. And that equates to about $1.2 billion. Now, the math might not look like it's exactly right, and that's because the percentage is of extramural funding, whereas that $40 billion number is total NIH. So a majority of it is in fact extramural, but not the full 40 billion. So across the NIH, it's $1.2 billion. And then each institute would provide the funding in proportion to what the overall institute's budget was. So for the NIA, essentially 3.65% of our extramural budget will go specifically to SBIR and STTR. And that for 2020 is going to be estimated to be somewhere between $115 and $120 million. Which actually, if we were talking 5 years ago, in 2015 would have been $32 million. So it's a very different program, and that's one of the reasons why we really established this office and are doing a lot more things, because we do realize that you're going to manage a $115+ million fund very differently than you would manage a $32 million fund. Sure. And there's a lot that comes with that. But that's the overall picture. And then there's the question of, okay, well, how do you then take that $115+ million and divide it out to small companies? Which I can talk about. Before I say that, I will say that there are other, there are so many mechanisms of funding at the NIH, and most of them never preclude small businesses from participating in those. So we do have small businesses that receive funding from the NIH outside of the SBIR and STTR programs. Sure. But the SBIR and STTR programs are the main mechanism for funding small businesses at the NIH. So for those programs, Congress structured them in phases and has no correlation to clinical trial numbers. Sure. In fact, much of SBIRs are in fact preclinical. But a phase 1 is meant to provide companies with funding to collect proof of concept data. And for different areas, what proof of concept is going to be a bit different. Take an example of a therapeutics. I often think of proof of concept as that first pilot in vivo study. And then phase 2 is around now taking that proof of concept and really doing some of the more robust development efforts. More testing, more models, to make sure that let's say it's a drug, to make sure that the drug is really ready to move kind of down that FDA, okay, now do we need to do the studies to show it's safe and to show that it could work in humans? And so you have that cascade of development steps that you will go through. But you first want to make sure that you understand what you're studying, what it does, the merits and the risks that you need to evaluate in that process of drug development. that's for drugs. Of course, the same thing goes whether we're talking about a digital health technology or a diagnostic, or really we're interested in the full gamut. But phase 2 would be more those development type studies, and I can talk about budgets in a minute. Then we have we recently relaunched the Commercialization Readiness Program, which can provide companies with additional funds, actually up to $3.3+ million to do activities that will enable commercialization or clinical development. And then we also have a phase 2B, which can be done after that phase 2, again, to move towards commercialization. And you usually will start with that phase 1, but if you collected data with other sources of funding and you already have that proof of concept, you can come in directly for that phase 2.
Okay.
In terms of kind of how big in dollars is each one of these projects, it will depend on the funding opportunity and the institute and whatever limits they set. There are congressionally passed maximums, but then Congress has also given the NIH, understanding that biomedical research is more expensive than other areas, has given the NIH the ability to get waivers approved by the Small Business Administration to go above those caps. And for the majority of the areas that we work on, they are within those waivers.
Good.
So most of the areas that we fund, our limits are $300,000 and $2 million, but Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, we have a specific funding opportunity that is $450,000 for that phase 1 and $2.5 million for that phase 2.
Okay.
Depending on the specific funding opportunity, I'd say phase 1s are going to be capped at between $300,000 and $500,000, depending on the funding opportunity. And phase 2s are going to be capped between $2 million and $2.5 million, depending on the funding opportunity. And then I mentioned that CRP, which can be $3.4, $3.6 million, and that phase 2B, which can be additional $3 million. If you add that together, you're talking about $8 or $9 million in maybe a 7-year period. Phase 2s are usually 6 months to a year. Phase 2s are usually 2 years in length. And that's per project. We do have companies that receive funding for multiple projects from us, and then they can have different funding streams. So it can be a significant source of capital, depending on your definition of significance. Of course, in something like drugs, where you're talking about, well over $1 billion to get developed, it's not going to take the company all the way there, or even close. But the way we really think about the program is that the companies will be able to use our funding to collect the data that can demonstrate to private investors, other stakeholders, pharma, whoever will be that next partner. This is a company and a project worth investing in. And they need to see some data first. And we feel like we're those people that can come in early, take those risks, provide funding for that data, so that the companies can then have a true path forward.
Yeah, I think that's outstanding. I mean, I think that's sort of one of the key points that, we're in this era of this so-called expanded valley of death, where, we don't see the traditional VCs and private equity groups and stuff caring anymore about the early stage. The valley of death has gotten so wide, and hey, $8 million, I mean, that gets you, it might not get you FDA approval, but you get to where you need to be, where, as you said, you can leverage it in everyone else's eyes. Then, hey, these are results that mean something.
And that's exactly the goal.
Yeah, and it's non-dilutive, which is wonderful. So, that's great. So something else you mentioned, which I thought was rather intriguing, and I'd just like to get your feedback. You started your career earlier at Pfizer. I was at GlaxoSmithKline for several years, and most of drugs back then or whatever, therapeutics were, for the most part, there were small molecules, occasionally there were a protein or what have you. But you were mentioning things like digital therapeutics. We're in a kind of unique area now. Now, my former employer got involved in this area known as electroceuticals, where they're looking at, not a drug, but some type of zap that ultimately does something to you. A lot of interesting microbiome research where, you have a bacteria cocktail. Are you seeing lots of grants or lots of SBIR applications for this, what I'll call non-traditional therapeutic interventions versus just traditional small molecules? Like, sort of what types of things are you seeing in terms of what some of these startups are looking to do in terms of treating aging as a disease?
Yeah, I think we are seeing everything, which is one of the things that's exciting about my job, right?
Yeah.
That I see such a wide variety of technologies. I mean, we still do see, of course, applications with just traditional drug approaches, although, some now around gene therapy and siRNA, some of the newer, so-called newer drug approaches. But then also, we do have, projects with neurostimulation or, of course, digital therapeutics. And, at the end of the day, I think where we're going to go, and if you look at cancer as an example, it really went to a place where, okay, now we understood exactly how to segment the disease, obviously breast cancer is different from prostate cancer, but then when you look at breast cancer, we now understand that there's several forms of breast cancer, and you're going to treat each form of breast cancer in a different way. So I think as we go forward, we're going to understand, and we already understand that understanding that underlying biology is so critical, so that we can map different approaches to the specific patient. And that will likely be a mix of multiple things. It may include some traditional drugs. It may include some other approaches that are non-drug based. Lifestyle is a part of it too, and healthy living, and understanding the microbiome. I mean, understanding the effect of diet, brain exercises. All of these things I think can play a role. And when we think about the portfolio, we know, of course, the Holy Grail will be that medicine that, would basically stop the aging processes, and that you can live forever, and you wouldn't have disease, or probably many years, whatever from that. But I think understanding that we are going to have disease, and including Alzheimer's and others that are going to be a part of us, and we can address it, and we will. But in the meantime, we can't forget about okay, so if somebody does have Alzheimer's disease, how can we best help them through the process? And some of that might be making sure that they know how to get that care, and how to make that care as comprehensive as possible. Making sure that they can connect with the caregivers. The caregivers are trained to provide the right care. All of this stuff is just as important as trying to then work on new medicines. We really have to think about it in a very comprehensive way, and address it from every angle. And I think that's where we're going to have the most bang for a buck. And this all, I don't view it as separate arches. I really think that they all end up working together. Absolutely.
One topic I wanted to say, get your feedback on, when I'm out and about, so sort of going to some of these longevity, aging related conferences, there's always this discussion going on whether aging itself should be a FDA sort of approved indication, or as opposed to, dementias or certain cancers, what have you. I know this is sort of, there's no right answer to this, but I just love to get your sort of feeling on this particular topic. I mean, the trial, of course, that comes to mind, because what they're looking for is this metformin study, where they're trying to look for a basket of biomarkers, I guess, at the end of the day, that they can call aging and get a claim in some context. What are your thoughts on this topic, if you would? I'd love to get it.
Yeah, so it's an area that we've been looking a lot at the NIH, of course. Essentially the area of geroscience.
Yes.
And understanding, aging as a process, and a process that once we truly understand the biology of that process, we can then target therapeutically or pharmacologically. Mm-hmm. I think there is promise, and we actually are funding a couple of companies in that area. Mm-hmm. I think we're starting to see, just in the past year, I've seen more and more applications in that area. Mm-hmm. I think once we have, we know enough about the biology to know certain targets right now. I think as the community continues to uncover the biology, that amount of targets will continue to expand, and we'll start to see more and more approaches that I think can have a significant impact. And we are working with some of the other institutes at the NIH that work on some of those diseases that are in many ways tied to aging, and figure out, can we help, in terms of prevention of those diseases, or, lengthening by these aging specific pharmacological approaches as part of the toolkit. And again, that's always important, that I feel like we have to remember there's always going to be multiple ways we have to target something.
Sure.
But I think as part of the toolkit, there is promise. And I think, in terms of FDA, of course, we have to see more things get there. And,
sure.
But I think that there is an openness to this. And we are very interested at the NIA. And if people have projects that address this and feel like they can target the aging process therapeutically or pharmacologically, it's something that we would like to help them test.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Coming back to you now, obviously you've served in a variety of roles. You've been in industry, university research, now government, of course, and clearly you've met a lot of fascinating people in these different domains, Alzheimer's research, cancer, and so forth. Any important influencers in your career, Todd, that, if it wasn't for them, you'd be doing something totally different right now, that you might want to give a shout out to, that have really influenced you along this path?
There's so many. I think, when I think about, my first internship at ASI, and my mentor there being Mel Lin, and that was really a very introduction to the industry side. And, did that before a PhD, which was, I think, actually really important, because then when I went to my PhD, I thought academic careers are an option, but I always had in my mind that I'm not sure that's a path I want to take. And I already had the benefit, probably I may have been the only, if not one of the very few, that had any industry expertise prior to a PhD. That really allowed me to kind of think about my research in a different way when I went through that PhD, and kind of always having that lens. So I think that was really important. Obviously, the people that I worked with, my mentor and others at Albert Einstein when I got my PhD, really helped, I think. Then going to Pfizer. So my Pfizer story, happy to talk about that.
Please do.
Yeah, so it's a very typical pharma story in some ways. So I actually applied for the job at Pfizer while I was still getting my PhD. I had expertise in a very specific type of instrument that there weren't that many people around the world that really fully knew how to do these types of studies. So I saw a posting, I think on Science Careers or something like that, for Pfizer, looking for that very specific expertise. I knew that I'm one of the only ones that have actually built multiple of these systems both before my PhD and during my PhD. I've been to, the headquarters of this company where they build the machines, and I've worked with them. So to me, it was like the perfect fit, and I applied, and sure enough, I got an interview right away. Flew down to St. Louis, had the interview. It was quickly determined that it was a perfect fit. But then, of course, I had to explain, well, I'm not yet done with my PhD. So they said, okay, well, wait, take your time. So I started to focus on my defense. I told them my goal is about 6 months. And as we got towards that point, I started getting, phone calls from the people that recruited me there. You may want to try to come a little quicker. We're hearing that there's going to be a major restructuring happening, and we'd like to get you here before that happens. So I expedited my defense, and I remember defending right before the holidays in December. At the same time, literally, that I was defending, Pfizer had movers at my apartment, starting to pack up stuff, so that a week after my defense, I was in St. Louis working at Pfizer. It was unbelievable, the speed and the turnaround. And this was now early January of 2007. And the day I got there, I found out that I believe, if I remember correctly, this is the types of things that stick in your head. Yeah. May 22nd was going to be the big restructuring announcement. So I was there for about 2 weeks before the announcement. And all I could hear about in those 2 weeks was how St. Louis was going to get shut down, and that I moved halfway across the country for a job that I'll be there for 2 weeks before finding out that the job is no longer going to be there. So it was a pretty stressful time. Of course, I moved my wife as well. She just started a job, and so it was definitely stressful for both of us. It turns out that as part of that major restructuring, is one of those things where it was for the whole company around the globe. So I think it was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where they figured it was the best time that everyone in all the different Pfizer sites can all be called into the offices, and there was video cast into all the Pfizer offices at the same time. And they did end up closing several sites in that announcement, but fortunately, St. Louis was not one of them. However, they did decide that, which made sense, that you would, for each disease area, they want it to only be worked on in a single Pfizer location, so that you wouldn't have multiple Pfizer research sites working on cardiovascular disease, as an example.
Sure.
So they did decide to shut down my department in St. Louis, the cardiovascular department, and move all cardiovascular research to Groton, Connecticut, which was about 45 minutes from where I just left. So, luckily, I was actually very fortunate in that I was notified that day that I was actually one of the very few people whose fate has been determined, and that I will be staying in St. Louis because Pfizer had committed to that collaboration with Washington University. I wanted to make sure that they saw that collaboration through. Yep. And I guess as the lowest man on the totem pole, I was the easiest person to offer as part of that commitment. And they notified Washington University that the collaboration will be continuing, and that I will continue will kind of start my role, playing a major role in helping to lead that collaboration. Sure. Now, of course, I was there for 2 weeks as a postdoc, didn't think I was going to end up leading this collaboration. In those 2 weeks, I had a lot of people above me that were helping to lead that collaboration. But, the way these, as I learned, it was actually a great experience for me, right? So the way these things often happen is many of the people that were leading the collaboration and were in my department ended up applying for new jobs in St. Louis for Pfizer, but in a different department. For example, the inflammation unit was multiple sites, and they decided, let's consolidate all of inflammation to St. Louis. So many of the people that I worked with ended up, leaving cardiovascular and getting a job in the inflammation unit, and staying in the same office at Pfizer in St. Louis, which actually in many ways was the best of both worlds, because I had more responsibility in terms of the collaboration, but I still had all this great support behind me.
Yep.
And, my mentors there, Brad Keller, Randy Newman, Mike Binkowski, Mike Tones, I can go on and on. It was amazing 2 years. And then also on the academic side, Nichols, Gina Bond, again, I can go on and on, but at the Washington University side. But they were so instrumental in still making this all work and actually getting a lot out of that collaboration and learning a lot about fatty acids and the role they play in cardiovascular pathology. Really, really important. And it was really important work, and I was excited to be able to have that role to make sure that all still gets done. And as that started to wind down was the point that I started to think about, okay, what do I want to do next? And I decided to go for a short-term 8-week policy fellowship at the National Academy of Sciences. I was actually focused on regional innovation clusters.
Okay.
And that's where I learned more about SBIR. And then right after, kind of as I was in that 8-week fellowship, I was applying for the AAAS fellowship. And right as I was finishing that 8-week fellowship, I found out that I was accepted and had the opportunity to go to NCI and working on SBIR. So it all ended up being a very smooth transition, although at the time it didn't feel anything like smooth. I didn't know what I was going to do at the end of the 8 weeks, and I had offers to come back to St. Louis and continue the research, but so it was an unknown period, but it all worked out, and we're happy now here in this area, and I think this is where I'll be for this is where we're raising our kids, and this is where we'll be. So it's exciting.
Outstanding. Yeah, it's it seemed like a lot of upheaval, but clearly, you not only got the exposure to so many fascinating disciplines and people, but you found something that really, is an unmet. In my perspective, it's an extremely unmet area, and what you're doing is it's so important.
And one thing to add there, when I look back and going back to your question, there's one word that I always sticks out, which is mentorship. And there is no way I would be, one, where I am today, but be able to be even remotely successful if it wasn't for the mentorship that I received throughout my career. And I talked about, going at Pfizer and WashU, and then, of course, at NCI, Michael Weingart and Andy Kurtz, true mentors in every sense of the word, and really trying to teach me, there were a lot of things I had to learn. I came in to the government, from the lab environment, there's a sense of professionalism I had to learn. There's so much that you learn in terms of how to work with people and how to lead. And I could have, you can't learn that stuff from a book.
No.
The only way you can learn that is from true mentors that put the people that support them in some ways ahead of the day-to-day minutia. And they did that, and they were always focused on my growth, and I'm fortunate. I try to pay that back now.
Absolutely, and it's a wonderful stuff. It's fascinating, Todd, hearing all of this and everything that you've been able to accomplish so far and what you're going to be doing, and it just really very eye-opening. And for everybody that's watching, going to be watching on the YouTube channel or listening on the various podcast networks, we've been talking with Dr. Todd Haim, Chief of the Office of Small Business Research at the National Institutes of Aging, Division of the United States National Institute of Health, really leading things in terms of small business innovation, and making this connection to allow companies, researchers to understand the nature of aging, extend healthy lifespan, healthy longevity. Todd, thank you, not just for coming on the show, but thank you for what you're doing. And thank you, as we say, the tagline of the show is moving the human story forward, and this really unmet area of aging and longevity. It's really an extremely bright future, and I'm just happy to see that you're leading this majorly important initiative, as we're saying, and sort of allowing small companies to blossom and get out there and get seen for the bigger potential. But it's really great stuff, and really an honor having you.
Yeah, and I think we're really fortunate that the leadership of the NIA, Dr. Richard Hodes, Dr. Marie Bernard. The Director of Division of Extramural Activities was Robin Barr, who recently retired, who was a great initial mentor to me here at NIA. Now Dr. Ken Santor. They all understand how critical small businesses are to NIA meeting its mission and helping patients and having products that are commercialized that help patients, and help the infrastructure, help the enterprise, and having NIA and NIH leadership, so cognizant of the role that small businesses can play, really facilitates us doing what we need to do here to make sure that we're building a program, that we're building budgets that actually make sense for the type of work that needs to be done, that we're connecting with stakeholders so that when companies get through our program, they have a place to go next. About how do we build the best portfolio? Outreach is a big part of it, guiding companies. We actually will work with companies before they apply, demystify that process for them, make sure, help explain to them what we expect in SBIR and what needs to be a part of that application. All of this is so critical, and we are fortunate to be in an environment where, going all the way to highest levels of leadership here, that there is an understanding of exactly the role that small business can play, and that we need to do our best to make sure that they're best positioned for success, so that we not just provide the funding, but we provide other resources that can help them get there.
Sure. No, that's outstanding. That's really outstanding stuff. Todd, thank you once again for taking the time, because this is very eye-opening, and I think it's extremely important for everyone to hear that there are these resources out there, as you said, not just the funding, but really the mentorship, as you were saying, in guiding what needs to happen, because this isn't as simple as doing an experiment and making $1 billion drug out of it. There's a lot that happens in between, and you bring that bridge to getting everyone there is outstanding. So I'm really glad we got the opportunity to profile you. Really great stuff. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
It's a real honor.